All right, good evening and welcome. I think as we get started, I'm sure others will trickle in. Um, it's a real privilege for us to be able to host this book talk with Seema Sirohi and Ambassador Arun Singh, two individuals who need no or very little introductions, but I will provide a formal introduction to them. We're here today, of course, to celebrate Seema's second book, which is this fantastic read, Friends with Benefits, the India-U.S. story, written very much from a first-person perspective. And being someone who's read a fair bit on India and US, I have to say that this was perhaps the most exciting read that I've done in a long time. I think the last time I read something of significance on the India and US was perhaps, I don't know, Dennis Cuck's book, which was a long time ago, which was a very different perspective on these issues. And then, of course, there's been a series of excellent books, Tanvi Madan's book, which looks at China, India, US. But this is written from a very different flair, and I think that's what gives it a degree of anxiety and excitement in the way it's been penned and authored. Seema is a senior journalist. She was perhaps one of the pioneering journalists who found herself in the United States in the 1980s as a correspondent for the Telegraph. I don't know, Seema, I mean, how many Indian journalists were in the US or in Washington in the 1980s?
Maybe 3 or 4.
3 or 4? Okay. Seema's a columnist for the Economic Times. She's obviously written for the Telegraph, Outlook, Anand Bazar, Patrika. She's written for the Christian Science Monitor, the Baltimore Sun. Her first book was published in 2003, Sita's Curse, Stories of Dowry Victims. And I think it's fair to say that Seema is, without doubt, one of the key stakeholders of this relationship, who's kind of followed its path, and fairly rocky path, if you read the book, from the 1980s to now. It also gives me great pleasure to introduce Ambassador Arun Singh. Ambassador Singh has been India's ambassador to the United States, to France, to Israel. He served in Tokyo, in Moscow, in New York. He was the DCM in the United States 2008 to 2013, so fairly turbulent years. And then again as ambassador 2015 to 16, just before the beginning of a massive transition in American politics. He was a member of the National Security Advisory Board. We're delighted to say that he's a non-resident senior fellow with Carnegie India. And I think we couldn't really have someone better to comment and reflect on this book than Ambassador Singh. So what I'm going to do in the flow is keep it pretty simple. What I thought I'll do is just start with perhaps asking you, Seema, is why don't you just tell us a little bit about why you wrote the book? So what is it that prompted you to write the book, and what were the kind of challenges in doing so? Because it's written from a very different perspective. It's a first-person perspective, but you need to rely on certain facts, which I'm guessing will be debated by many in this room. They'll see certain events in a very different way. You saw it in a particular way. You also befriended in these last 30 years almost every key actor, including perhaps every Indian ambassador to the United States, I dare say, from the late 80s to now. So why don't you just give us a sense of why you wrote the book and what were one of the key compulsions?
So, thank you, Rudra, and thank you, Ambassador Singh, for being here. And thanks to all my friends and well-wishers. I'm truly, truly honored that so many of you showed up. It's a busy day. I know there are many events. To come back to Rudra's question, why did I write the book? I was in DC. I first got to DC in 1988. And the relationship was not in a good place. We were not exactly friends. Forget the benefits. I mean, it was a very testy relationship. And I saw the transition, and I felt that it was important to document it and show the reader how much has changed in this relationship. And, when I got there, India really had very few friends. In the US Congress, we had one friend, Congressman Stephen Solars. And there were many, many anti-India congressmen and senators who would sort of take up the Kashmir issue or raise the Khalistan issue because the agitation in Punjab was going on. The Pentagon was very much a votary of Pakistan. The State Department kind of kept the relationship going, but mainly to maintain parity between Pakistan and India. The Commerce Department was the Department of Technology Denial. Depending on India's latest missile test, they would lower the bar or raise the bar. So it was just a very tough time. The US saw India as an ally of the Soviet Union. The Indians saw the Americans as the people who had sent the 7th Fleet in 1971 during the Bangladesh War. Memories were very, very sort of vivid of that. So it was very difficult for the two countries to talk to each other. I say in the book that there was no love language, quote unquote, just a dictionary of stern words that we threw at each other. So, I mean, things began to change with India's nuclear tests in 1998. There was a real dialogue between the two sides on security issues. It's the first time, I think, the dialogue between Jaswant Singh and Strobe Talbot tackled the issue of China being on our border and undermining India's security. It was followed by the Kargil War, in which President Clinton took a very clear stand in favor of India. So much so that Indian diplomats were really quite shocked that an American president was saying so very clearly that Pakistan had to go back. Then came the nuclear deal during George W. Bush, his presidency, and Prime Minister Manmohan Singh. After that, it's been on the up and up for the most part. So I felt this trajectory is very important to document, and that's what kind of encouraged me to write the book.
So let me ask you, in your long experience in Washington, what would be if there was a time that was the toughest for you as an Indian journalist operating in Washington, D.C., and I'm guessing a large part of the 80s and 90s was pretty tough, but was there a particular period that was difficult for you as an Indian journalist working there?
Absolutely. I remember the 1998 tests, the nuclear tests. Every time you turned a corner, some high-level American was sort of denouncing India and saying really harsh things. President Clinton famously said that we're going to come down on them like a ton of bricks. And they did. They sanctioned India, and Indian scientists were sent back. They were not given visas. I mean, there were 100 things that were going on. So at that time, I must say, as an Indian and as a journalist, I found it very difficult. Because, after a point, your professional life and your personal life can sort of merge. I remember I told one of the State Department officials, it took a lot of courage to do that. After a press briefing, I told him that, we've just come out of this phase of anti-Americanism, and this kind of public berating of India is not a good idea. So he listened. To his credit, he listened. So that was the toughest time.
When did you first see from your vantage point, and I think there are many here who've obviously been key turners of the strategic kind of canvas with the United States. Ambassador Saran, who's sitting here, played a key role, perhaps in the trickiest time of Indian diplomacy, and many others. But what was that one moment that you would say where you said to yourself as a journalist, where you were able to come back to your house or your room and says that the relationship has turned?
I guess the first marker was the Kargil War, but the real deal was the nuclear deal. Because then the American ship of state, so to say, had turned towards India. President Bush sort of broke a lot of China, quote unquote, to give India this nuclear deal. Prime Minister Manmohan Singh worked really hard, staked his government on that. Many Indian diplomats, Ambassador Saran is here, he knows exactly how difficult it was. But I think that to me was a very big moment, a seminal moment.
The section that you covered on the nuclear deal, and you've quoted my colleague Evan Feigenbaum, who was there towards the end of the deal, around 2007, 2008, because I think on the US side, he had the unenviable task of dealing with the NSG. Bill Burns, in his book, Back Channel, calls this essentially brute force diplomacy, where very few instances where the United States use the kind of political capitals. So much so, as you mentioned in the book, that Americans threatened Austria by saying is that we won't allow your flights in if you don't get this done. Was that sense of urgency and the sense that this is really a turning point clear in 2005, 6, 7, 8? That with all, so when you were covering, for instance, I guess, Ambassador Saran's visits to Washington, the tricky conversations that took place, the discussions at the IEA, at the NSG, then there was the whole issue around the Hyde Act, for instance. But was there a sense of purpose that this is really going to change this relationship?
Absolutely. I think it was clear to us in 2005, something big is happening. And, the joint statement at that time, the 2005 joint statement is very important. I mean, that gave an indication what the Americans were trying to do and how they were, trying to include India as to be recognized as a de facto nuclear weapons power. And it was like breaking a 30-year-old regime around the nuclear issues. So I think it was pretty clear to us. After that, it was just a long slog, step after step after step. At every step, we thought it's going to die. And it was resurrected many times, thanks to the political will of the two leaders and thanks to the very, very effective diplomacy. I mean, I've heard Americans say that the Indian diplomats got the better of them.
If I can turn to Ambassador Singh. So one is, it'll be just interesting to get your reflections on the book as someone who was on the inside, while Seema was kind of on the outside. And to try and see, perhaps, and if you'd kind of maybe outline for us what were some of the contradictions, if you can, in terms of the way Seema perhaps sees it in the book and maybe the way you do, if you can. And also maybe just tell us about, you were there in 2008, just after the nuclear deal was signed. You were there till 2013, tricky years, the Mumbai attacks in 2008, the Obama transition. So if you could just perhaps reflect a little bit on the relationship before we get to your ambassadorship.
Thank you, Rudra. So I must begin by saying that I found Seema's book very fascinating and useful because she covers a whole span from really 2000 till now. And based on her first-hand experience of being there, talking to different people. And as you mentioned, books have been written on the various aspects, but this kind of span coverage is not there. Dennis Cuck's book brings us to 1992. So there's still a gap between 92 and 2000, and Seema gives us the period after that. And of course, on every aspect, there can be more detailed research. Broadly, I agree with the kind of overall picture that Seema has painted. And of course, you can always disagree on some specific aspects. There are different vantage points, perspective, lenses. But broadly, I agree with the perspective. I just wanted to elaborate on a few based on what I observed, which reflects also on how the US system operates and how we will need to handle that system. Because it's a complex system, and I must say that, despite the fact that it's an open system, democratic system, among the various diplomatic assignments I have done, the most difficult system to operate in is the United States. Because you have the administration, you have the Congress. In the administration, every wing has certain measure of autonomy. The White House, the State Department, Pentagon, CIA, FBI, DHS, and you have to handle all of them. Then you have the Congress. And in the Congress, you have 435 in the House, 100 in the Senate, 535 independent political entrepreneurs. Because they all have to raise money themselves for their elections, aside from central funding that they get. They set their own policies. And you can get a hit from any of them. And so you have to reach out to as many members of Congress as you can. And Seema mentioned about there being only one friend of India in the US Congress at that time, Stephen Solarz. Today, the largest single country caucus in the House is the India caucus, almost 170 members. Largest single country caucus in the Senate is the India caucus, almost 40 members. So you can see the change that has happened. So based on all this, the first thing I observed was in the context of 2611. So I reached Washington for my first assignment on 9th October 2008. And Seema is talking about the Civil Nuclear Cooperation Agreement. It was signed on 10th October 2008. So obviously I didn't contribute anything to it. But in my work after that, I benefited a lot from that because the relationship really transformed, because the US system had judged that if they want to advance the relationship with India, they needed to break down the technology barriers for cooperation. And the only way to break down the technology barriers for cooperation was to do a civil nuclear cooperation agreement. Because otherwise, related to that, there were a whole set of restrictions because of which US could not share higher levels of technology with India. And unless that happened, obviously you could not even advance besides civilian technology in terms of defense cooperation. So if you see till 2008, we hardly bought defense supplies from the US. Now we have contracted to buy more than $20 billion of defense supplies. We are now talking of a defense technology partnership. There's been now talk of GE having filed for approval for sharing jet engine technology. So that kind of thing would have been not possible. But even given all that, when 2611 happened, US obviously stepped in to be helpful as much as it could in terms of sharing information, intelligence. They were helpful, I think, tremendously in terms of breaking down the intelligence related to whatever we had captured, which enabled us to also trace it back to Pakistan-sponsored persons who had come here. But if you read Bob Woodward's book of that period, the US Deputy Secretary of State, soon after it happened, next day called the Pakistan High Ambassador there and said that we have assessed that the Pakistan government or its agencies are not involved in this. Now, whether they have assessed or not, it was a signal to Pakistan that that is the line we are going to take. And therefore, that is the way to handle this situation, that the Pakistan government and agencies are not involved, and that use that as a peg to de-escalate the situation. So they took that public position, whatever may have been their internal assessment. So we have to factor in that in assessing anything, obviously they'll be motivated by their own interests. And that's how we'll have to play that. The second thing, again, in terms of transitions that you spoke about, there was a lot of anxiety in India about what would happen in the transition from the Bush to the Obama period. Because President Bush had been very helpful doing the Civil Nuclear Cooperation Agreement, but for his support, the agreement would not have been possible. And his message was clear that we need to build a relationship with India. China is a growing challenge, and that's one of the factors, and you have to do this. President Obama, as senator, had moved amendments in the Senate, which would have essentially killed the agreement, as had Hillary Clinton, who then became Secretary of State. So there was a lot of anxiety in India as to what was going to happen. But once he moved in, the message from the administration was clear that while they had earlier opposed the nuclear deal, now they took it as settled law, and they would operate on that basis. Now that was very helpful, because if you see the Trump administration, they didn't accept any settled law that came from the Obama administration. They walked back from the Paris Climate Agreement. They walked back from JCPOA. So no incoming administration, unless there is a specific supportive resolution also in the Congress, feels itself bound down. But the Obama administration took the position that we'll take it as settled law. I think the second thing we observed, which again, handling the US system, in October 2008, President Obama as candidate had given an interview to Time magazine, where he had said that he was thinking in terms of need for appointing a special envoy on Kashmir. And that, as you know, is a red line for India. We don't want any third-party role, we don't want any special envoys, and that would have really complicated the message. Now, between the period of his election in November and his coming into power in January next year, enough messages were sent through non-governmental channels to the incoming team that any such thing would really complicate the relationship and would take several steps back. And once therefore they came into power, the message was clear that there was going to be no special envoy on Kashmir. And Richard Holbrooke, when he was given the mandate for handling with Afghanistan, Pakistan, as everyone knows, he was dying to also get the mandate for India. and see if he could also, try and show something to Pakistan on Kashmir issues, to get something from them on Afghanistan. But the Obama administration was very clear. No mandate to him on India or Kashmir. Just stay out of that. So I think there are ways of handling and dealing with the dynamics of the system in the US that we have to learn. And the final one I'll mention is in 2009 or 10, I forget, President Obama made a visit to China. And after that visit, there was a joint statement that they had issued where they spoke about working together in South Asia. Now that really, again, is sort of a red line anathema for India, because it recalled for people memories of 1998, where after a nuclear test, they had done a joint statement about working together in South Asia. And there was a lot of sort of negative reaction in India. And then I think it reached certainly the White House, and it was conveyed to us that what happened was not something that the administration was fully behind. It was something that the Chinese slipped in at the last moment, at the last phase of the negotiations. And the negotiators who were dealing with it were not people who were involved with South Asia and didn't fully understand the implication. Now, true or not, that was an explanation that was given. And at least the message you could get conveyed that we have sensitivities. And the fact is, from then to now, there's no such statement coming from US and China. So basically, I would say that you have to handle transitions. The US system is complex. They have different compulsions and interests. And we have to learn to work the US system, which I think we are certainly learning to do with greater effectiveness. Thank you.
No, thank you, sir. If I can just turn to Seema and then back to Ambassador Singh. So clearly the two running themes in your book, and there are many running things. And I think one of the things that struck me is the amount of emphasis that you give to personalities rather than structure, right? So there's this basic assumption that the structure of the strategic relationship in many ways predetermines what can happen and what can't. But you show very clearly that without the mavericks at work at a particular point of time, those ends cannot be met. So personalities play a very important role, and I want to talk a little bit about that. Plus the US Congress, which Ambassador Singh kind of highlighted, which is something perhaps in India we don't give enough attention to, of how does the Senate and how does the Congress actually work. I mean, only last week, according to the newspapers, the Indian National Security Advisor was in meeting with his counterpart in the US. A lot of those discussions about technology denial regimes, they were about ITAR. And it just occurred to us when we were leading the US reports on these, on these initiatives, that actually is going to take a big lift on the part of the US Congress when you think of exemptions. So it'll be good to get into that. But one of the running things has been Pakistan throughout your book, right? And we're obviously in a very different world today than we were even in sort of in 2008 or perhaps towards the beginning of the Obama sort of relationship. So why don't you just tell us a little bit about, let me just start with, is what place does Pakistan today have in American political capital and imagination? And how has that changed from your perspective?
So today, the importance of Pakistan is much reduced. But when I first got to Washington, D.C., basically, to put it bluntly, Pakistan could do no wrong and India could do no right, while China had a free pass on technology, on everything. So I remember, of course, the Americans needed Pakistan because of the war in Afghanistan. And the ISI was a conduit for sending money and weapons to the Mujahideen. So I understand that. But when Indian diplomats raised the issue of terrorism as emanating from Pakistan, American officials, many of whom I got to know well over the years, would just turn a blind eye. They would pretend not to notice, or they literally yawning in your face, US intelligence agencies were giving the same information on Pakistan. Everything was available to the State Department, but somehow the State Department found the evidence insufficient, quote unquote. So I began to wonder, what is going what is going on? Are the Indian diplomats wrong? Are we wrong? Am I missing something? So I decided to find some senior sort of retired CIA officer to interview, to get it from a horse's mouth. So I found one such person whom I talk about in the book, went to meet him. He had just retired as the chief of the South Asia region. He told me very bluntly, his name is Vincent Canestraro. I still remember. He said that the Pakistanis have given us, that is the Americans, the largest base for the CIA. So we need them, and no matter what the evidence, the State Department will not take action. I mean, there have been times when the US had exact amount, how much money was paid by Pakistan to China for ring magnets. Ring magnets were used in the nuclear program in the centrifuges. They had the bill, actually, because their intelligence sort of capacities and capabilities are immense. That information was available to US officials, but they chose not to act. So that was the situation then. And it was, of course, very disheartening for Indian diplomats. They would argue that, Pakistan should be declared a state sponsor of terrorism, something that no US president was willing to do, no matter what the crime, no matter how big the terrorist attack, no matter how many people died. Because their equities in Pakistan were just so great, or their goals in South Asia were just so different from India's goals. So that made improving relations tougher between India and the US in those days, the 80s, 90s, I would argue even the 2000s. Even during, as Ambassador Singh pointed out, during George W. Bush, a president who did a major nuclear deal for India, even his administration wasn't willing to name Pakistan. So that was then. Now, the situation is quite different. The Pakistanis can't get a phone call returned. Their prime ministers don't get called by the US president. I mean, they run around to get meetings. The only place, as you mentioned, the US Congress, that's one place where they can do things. Because there are so many congressmen, so many donations to take for so many campaigns. So that's the playing field for diplomats, lobbyists, evangelists, NGOs, what have you. So that's where they will continue to raise issues regarding India. And they have been doing that since 2014, since, Narendra Modi became the Prime Minister.
So if I could just turn to you on Pakistan. So in 2015, when you arrived as the ambassador, it's around the same time that the basic temptation for withdrawal from Afghanistan and the United States had begun to kind of become more palpable. And, Obama had made those speeches saying is that we'll withdraw, we put a clock on it. That was, I think, 2014. So did you begin to detect that as the rationale for Afghanistan became weaker and weaker, that actually the rationale for India became stronger and stronger, or is that a false binary?
No, I think the rationale for India is not linked to the rationale for Pakistan. Pakistan is certainly becomes an irritant in the relationship, US-India relationship. The rationale for India is China, related to the challenge that the US sees from China. And starts with the Bush administration, and they, as President Bush made clear, that one of the reasons he wanted to build with India, aside from the economic and technological and other opportunities, was the challenge that they were beginning to see emerging from China, which was different from the Clinton administration. Because the time of the Clinton administration, the whole thrust was integration of China in the international mainstream to bring about economic and political liberalization in China. Now, of course, they are saying that that strategy has failed, it was a mistake. But so you see during the Bush administration. When the Obama administration came in the beginning, they wanted to be slightly different on this. So the first couple of years of the Obama administration, what you heard was strategic reassurance to China. that the US is willing to accommodate China's rise in the international system, subject, of course, to certain China observing certain norms, but strategic reassurance. After a while, they realized that this was not going to work. They needed to have some pushback on China, so suddenly the word used was pivot to Asia. Then some within the administration argued that pivot was too strong a word. You are sending too strong a signal to China. So they started talking of rebalance to Asia. Even the rebalance they could not do because challenges in West Asia continued. And in 2014, you had Russia's action in Ukraine and Crimea. So the focus on Europe remained. So even that they were not able to. So really the gauntlet to China was thrown by the Trump administration. If you look at the national security strategy of 2017, then the national defense strategy, for the first time, China is clearly identified as the main threat to the United States. And in that framework, the relationship with India is articulated also in a certain way. And in the Trump administration, virtually every senior official, vice president down to senior cabinet figures, made repeated statements pointing out the challenge from China and the challenge from the Chinese Communist Party. Because that was seen by many as taking one step further, challenging the very sort of relevance or acceptability of the Chinese Communist Party beyond what China was doing. And then once the Biden administration came in, then the issue was how would they walk back, revert to the Obama period, but again, partly their own assessments, partly also domestic compulsions, they have signaled that they will continue the approach on China. What was done during the Trump administration. There's been no walking back on the various tariffs. You see all the technology restrictions that have been put in place. The incident with the balloon will only heighten further the antipathy in the US Congress. So the approach basically is that engage with China, keep communication lines open, but accept China as your main economic, technological, military rival. And as President Biden said in the State of Union address, use that also to unify domestically within the US and get various measures passed through Congress. So having said that, in the Obama administration, the Pakistan factor played out in different ways. They needed Pakistan because of what they were doing in Afghanistan. And now in 2011, of course, they found Osama bin Laden there. That complicated the relationship because they didn't inform Pakistan before doing the operation. And after that, in an incident, they killed 24 Pakistani soldiers along the Pakistan-Afghanistan border. After that, Pakistan stopped US supplies going into Afghanistan, and they had to use the Northern Distribution Network. So for more than a year, US aid to Pakistan was blocked. But Northern Distribution Network, very slow, very expensive, so they tried to revive the relationship. So in 2015-16, when they started talking about working hard to pull out of Afghanistan, once again the thought was to incentivize Pakistan. So US policy on Pakistan sort of varies between pressurizing Pakistan and incentivizing Pakistan. So 2016, it was incentivize Pakistan. So at that time, despite all the positive movement in the relationship with India, after the decline in 12-13, with 14-15, it really picked up. President Obama was here in 2015 as chief guest on Republic Day. In 2010, he had declared support for India's permanent membership, Security Council. 2016, they went on to declare India a major defense partner. Despite all that, in February 2016, they said they will supply 18 F-16 aircraft to Pakistan. Now that again was, for us, a very difficult decision. And again, reflecting on how the US system operates, we went all out to lobby US Congress against this deal. And the Congress blocked the deal. Again, shows the relevance and power of the US Congress, and the supply of F-16 aircraft didn't take place. So yeah, that was the dynamic that was playing out.
Can I say something about China? So during President Bill Clinton's time, you can't imagine how different it was. They were selling everything to China, whatever China wanted. The US was selling everything legally, openly, because US corporations were making just too much money to be disturbed. And all of that technology has come back to bite them. I say in my book that it's the US that helped sort of raise China from puberty to adulthood. And now, blocking semiconductors or other technology is going to be very hard because the Chinese have sort of run away with all the technology. They also stole the most sophisticated nuclear warhead from the Los Alamos laboratory. That also I've talked about in the book. So that was happening, but no action was taken, no sanctions were put, nothing happened. I don't know what it was, but it was a combination of factors. I think politically there was no will to sort of, they didn't think China was going to be a rival. And there was a latent feeling that a non-Western power can never rival the United States. There was something of that also happening. So I just wanted to point that out.
So in your book, Seema, you talk about, you say, in a sense that 2007 was a critical turning point when following Jiang Zemin's visit to the United States, and how, and we forget that, it's for the last 15 years, for instance, it was a very different history between the US and China, till only perhaps 2016, as Ambassador Singh said, 2017. In Washington today, if I can kind of place you today, for instance, the sense that we get, for instance, is number one, that there's a structural shift to the US-China relationship. So it's not transient, it's not temporary, it's structural, it's strategic. Number two, the sense we also get is, at least the readouts that we've sort of seen for, prior to what was supposed to be Blinken's visit to China till that balloon got shot, was that, the visit was supposed to be about terms of reference. It was about saying is that, listen, competition is here to stay, but we have to find some guardrails that competition does not slip into conflict. And I'm guessing he's referencing primarily to the Taiwan Strait crisis. Right? So it's a very different kind of a dynamic to sort of US-China, which is also propelling the US system perhaps to focus even more on countries like India, for instance. And one way in which it's doing that and where we're reciprocating is through a new vehicle called the Initiative on Critical and Emerging Technologies. And I'm going to bring Ambassador Singh into this following the interview that you did with the Mint on ISET. But is that how you see the US-China relationship? There's a structural shift. This is about long-term strategic competition. So the people that you speak to, because you speak to people outside of Foggy Bottom or outside of the Pentagon, so you're talking to Congress, you're also talking to corporates who've got long investments in Chengdu, in Guangzhou, you're talking to American corporations who are not showing too much appetite in actually unplugging, although they may be diversifying.
See, official America has woken up, I would say. But corporate America is still not ready to, disentangle because it's going to cost them a lot. So there is that tug of war going on in Washington. The Republicans and Democrats mostly are united that China is the main rival. They have to somehow counter China without, creating a real conflict. And there's also a debate whether US preparedness, defense preparedness at this time is enough to sort of rival China if something were to happen. The Chinese Navy is said to be larger than the US Navy already. Things like that. So there are some strategists in Washington who are arguing that the US should sort of leave the Ukraine war to the Europeans and focus on Asia, focus on China, and get its act together. And, all the arms manufacturers are, of course, very happy at whatever is happening. But yes, there is a structural shift. But at the people-to-people level, I don't think there's that much recognition that China is this power that's out to kind of subdue the US or best the US, like it was against the Soviet Union. Because the Chinese penetration of American society is so diffuse and so sort of widespread. For example, US academics are not really all with the US politicians on this. There is one school of thought in India that fears that the US might cut a deal once again with China, like the G2, just like Bill Clinton tried to do and Obama tried to do, the group of two where the two big powers will manage the world together. I don't think that is going to happen because the process of decoupling has begun.
As I was saying, I was just wondering for your reflections of how you follow U.S. politics very carefully. So how do you see the U.S.-China kind of dynamic at the moment? And do you buy the argument, which we hear a lot in Delhi now, but also in European capitals, is this really structural? In the sense, something has changed for sure, but under the rubric of change, a lot can be done which is cooperative. And once that cooperation starts, different constituencies will be built up, which gives that a good amount of momentum. So, and on the second is, I was wondering if you could reflect a little bit on this new initiative for critical and emerging technologies. There was the NSSP, Next Steps in Strategic Partnership in 2004. There's the DTTI between the two countries, which Seema's taken not so kind of analysis on in her book. There are many references to what DTTI could do more. There's obviously a nuclear deal, which is a completely different process in itself. There's a fair bit of confusion about, I think, what ISET actually is. The Hindustan Times says this is the next big thing in the relationship. The Financial Express has already jumped the gun and said the US is giving us technology when it's not. Some say this is just another DTTI. And then there are others who are actually commenting saying, is this the next nuclear deal? So could you just give us a sense of what ISET is and why does it matter given the current geopolitical place that we're in?
Thanks, Rudra. So 2 questions that you've asked. So first, very briefly on the China thing, and then I'll move on to ISET. On China, as Seema mentioned, clearly there are different voices in the US. In terms of the administration, from the time of the Trump administration now going into this administration, I think there is a clear recognition that China is their main challenge. And as the US Secretary of State has said, China is the only country today with the intent and the capability to challenge a US role in the global context and try and change the rules and norms. So they see it that way. In the US Congress, I think there's even greater antipathy to China compared to the administration. You've seen that the Republicans have just created the new committee on dealing with the competition from China. But despite that, in the corporate sector, there are a lot of companies who heavily invested in China. The US financial companies, the Wall Street companies are also heavily invested in China, and they are certainly pushing for more normalization in the relationship. But what has certainly happened is that created a sense of risk related to further investments in China, especially in the high-tech sector. So they would think twice before doing that kind of investment, and they are looking for alternative possibilities rather than fresh investment in China. Because I saw at one particular event where there were some US administration officials present and US industry, where the industry representatives said, but you are the ones who asked us to go and invest in China many years ago. Now you are asking us to pull out. And I think at the moment there's also concern that many of them have pulled out of Russia. Because and not because the administration asked them to, but because of public sentiment. And they were worried about public sentiment and pressure on their shareholders. So they pulled out and they've taken big losses. Exxon, for example, had lost $20 billion in Russia. So given that, at the moment, they don't want to face big losses in China, but also worry about the risks for the future. So I think that dynamic is certainly playing out. Now, in terms of ISET, my sense is, based on the comments I've seen coming out in the public domain and some other conversations, that this was a process that started almost 2 years ago. And I think there was a thinking, as you referred to the next steps in strategic partnership of 2004, the nuclear deal of 2008. And since the time of the nuclear deal, and especially when the relationship went down in 12-13, there was always a talk of what can be the next big thing in the relationship to give it another sort of a push. But that having been said, I think, and a lot of things happened, support for permanent membership, major defense partner, membership of export control regimes, but still. So I think there was a sense that one, there's growing strategic convergence between India and the US, but the economic and technological convergence has not yet matched the strategic convergence. And for example, if you look at the US-China trade relationship, it's almost $700 billion. Now for us, US is our largest trading partner, but still about $160 billion. So that was one dimension. The second dimension was that everybody was saying that there's a perfect storm of technology coming. That AI, quantum, cyber, 6G, private sector participation in space, biotech, are all going to completely transform the way we live, the way we work. There'll be a whole new set of industries coming up, including the kind of services sector we see. And in all these areas, there is very little work going on at the moment anywhere. Some work in China, some work in the US, in the startup space, and also in India. So can we use this kind of cooperation to build a new framework for interaction between India and the US? Build new framework for cooperation as new industries develop in this area, either services, manufacturing, digital, and based on the framework that emerges, starts working on norms and standards right from the beginning, rather than having to deal with norms and standards after they are set. Because that was one of the problems and disadvantages that we faced in India. And once you've done this, then see if you can look at what kind of trading arrangements you can work out to facilitate this. Because as you know, we've had very great difficulty in even doing limited trade agreements with the US. We've been talking about it for 4 years, 5 years. And we are not able to do it because there are existing interests on both sides that block this. So I think the idea was, given all this, is there a way to partner in the critical and emerging technologies? Now clearly this is something that cannot be done only at the level of governments. You have to involve industry, because a lot of work is happening. Even in some of these areas, even industry is trying to figure out what to do. What will they need? What kind of technical manpower they will need for the work they will do in the future. So there is a conversation also between industry and academia, because they need to tell the academia that, look, this is what we may need. Can you work to identify syllabus, teaching, whatever, so that you train people in this area, which we are able to utilize later. Now, if all work is starting at this stage, is there a way for Indian academia with top level capability to bring in syllabi and teaching of world-class levels, so that later there can be seamless movement of human capital that works to your advantage? So I think it is this kind of thinking based on which the two governments, as I understand it, based on their own internal consultation and then discussion with each other, have been able to launch this initiative on critical and emerging technologies. But we must understand, right now, it is the first seed that has been formally planted. Now, based on this, work has to be taken forward. A message has been given by the two national security councils, based on support of the leaders, to the wider establishment in both countries, that this is the cooperation we are willing to take forward. We see each other as trusted partners in these areas. Because as you know, in all these areas, the US is now blocking cooperation with China. And US industry and academia would be worried that if they move ahead with India, later would the administration block it. But if the message is that from the national security perspective, we see India as a worthwhile partner, then they would be more willing to move ahead. So I think that message has been sent, areas have been identified, initial mechanisms identified to take this forward. But a lot of work now needs to be done on both sides, and then together to advance this cooperation.
No, thank you, sir. I think that's the note that needs to go out, because I think on ISET, for instance, there's a lot of activity, but perhaps not as much strategic communication from both sides. And maybe that has to do with the fact because NSEs are very different bodies in the way they deal with sort of public affairs. But Seema, I'm going to just sort of ask you one last, slightly more personal question before I open the door and to audience questions. And I've left the little issue of Russia, Ukraine, and US, India for the audience. How are you perceived today in the United States compared to the 1980s? The book gives us a good sense about how tough it was in the 80s, 90s, 2000s. As the US-India relationship changed, has your relationship also changed, and your stakeholders' relationships changed with you or Indian journalists more broadly now working in US?
That's a difficult question to answer. See, because access is always difficult in Washington, D.C. as a foreign journalist. As an Indian journalist, doubly so, because there's a clear hierarchy. On top are the New York Times, Washington Post, the TV channels, then other American newspapers. Then among foreign journalists, the British are on top, because the British accent goes a long way, you know. And as I always say, that you can't talk to a US official without a mention of Churchill, you know. So access is still difficult. I would say it's not as if we are being invited every day to the White House for a briefing. When there's an important visit, then they will seek the journalists from that region and give them a briefing or two. It all depends on what personal rapport you can strike with a particular official in the State Department or Pentagon. Many times I've had experiences where at a reception, one Pentagon guy will say, yes, we'll meet, we'll have lunch, and give me his card and I'll send him this earnest email, and there'll be no acknowledgement because he'll go to the press office or the communications people and they'll put a block on it because everything is channeled through the like in any large bureaucracy. So that's a kind of a frustrating thing. But this is not to say that I haven't enjoyed my time there. I've had wonderful, wonderful, friendships with US officials, with Indian officials, and I've managed to survive.
And I'm guessing, but access is pretty clear and easy for the Indian embassy, clearly, right?
Yes. Yes, Indian ambassadors and Indian officials are your bread and butter, basically, They give you a perspective, then you go to the US Congress sometimes. That is easier than the administration.
Rudra, I just wanted to...
This mic. Let's use this.
Rudra, I just wanted to add on that every time Seema called me, I used to always get worried because she always had that little bit of extra information that I was not comfortable having.